Hello everyone. So, since I've been posting about Michelangelo recently, I've been inspired to tell the story in entirety about the Sistine Chapel, about how Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel and what it took him to create it, all in depth of me expressing the entire process as much as I can about it. I just want to say that I'm very passionate about Michelangelo, and as many of you may know, he's a big reason why I became an artist. And I've studied him my whole life, and I feel like I know about Michelangelo, about his biography, more than even many of his biographers do, or many art historians do. I've I've I have like, I don't know, God knows how many books on his work. Um, I've read a lot about him. I've seen many documentaries about him. I've seen art history lectures about him. I've actually traveled to France and Italy twice to study his works in real life. So I'm not just I'm not just a hack who talks about Michelangelo and knows nothing about him. I know a lot about his life. I know a lot about what it took him to create the work that he did, and I'm sure that there's a lot of things that I don't know about him because it's like he lived till he was late 80s. So like there's a lot that still is unknown about him. Some people, I'm sure there's things that I don't know that are known, but there's things that I may not know because I realized that I don't know everything about him. I mean, it'd be arrogant to think that I know everything about Michelangelo, but I'll tell the things that I do know. And pardon if I get a little emotional or passionate throughout any part of this video because I'm just in total awe of how amazing he was and how much of a creative genius Michelangelo was. Um, I'm just I think about him all the time when I do my work, and he's really like like the like the role model template for me as an artist. He's who I try to follow to the best of my ability in my own way. I'm not trying to be Michelangelo, but he's really the inspiration behind how much I work on my art and how seriously I take my art and all of that. So I'd like to start the story. By the time Michelangelo got the commission to paint the Sistine Chapel from Pope Julius II, he was already a famous artist. He was in his early 30s, and he's already sculpted St. Peter's Pieta. He already sculpted the Statue of David. He's done other numerous works. He's done several paintings. Um, he learned painting when he was an apprentice to Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was one of the premier fresco painters in Florence at the time that Michelangelo was a teenager. And he hasn't really done fresco painting since, but it was known about him that he was an apprentice in the Ghirlandaio studio. And there was a point where young Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were competing in Florence in the uh, Palazzo Vecchio, inside one of the halls. They were both asked to paint frescoes on separate sides, and it was an epic competition between the two, but neither one completed their work. and Michelangelo was called in by Pope Julius II to work for him in Rome. And Michelangelo at that point was already known to be the greatest sculptor in the world, because nobody even came close to what he did with St. Peter's Pietà and the Statue of David. Those two works were unparalleled in the history of the world at that time. And a lot of artists were jealous of Michelangelo, including Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. They both they both were inspired by Michelangelo. They both loved his work. They knew that he was a genius, but they were very much intimidated by him because they weren't the best artists, because Michelangelo was alive and he was the best artist. He was known to be, at that time, the superstar of art. And a lot of artists were jealous of him. And Pope Julius called in Michelangelo to Rome, to Michelangelo to design the tomb for the Pope. It was a custom at that time for popes to commission their tombs when they were still alive, because it would take an artist sometimes decades to create the tomb. And there was a lot of negotiation between Pope Julius and Michelangelo until they reached a certain agreement, and then Michelangelo went off to Carrara to quarry the marble with which he would use to sculpt the tomb of Pope Julius. And it was supposed to be like the most ambitious tomb in the history of the world, with like over 60 oversized marble figures. The tomb that exists today in San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome is just a ghost of what the original tomb was supposed to be. And the original tomb, I believe, was supposed to be in St. Peter's Basilica, which is the premier church in Catholicism. And it was supposed to be like this giant, like, monument that was just supposed to be overwhelming with like, I think there might be a sketch by Michelangelo that he did of his idea of what he was supposed to do. But at that time, young Raphael and his mentor Bramante, who was an architect for the Pope, they knew that Michelangelo was working in the Vatican, and they made a plan to undermine Michelangelo because they were jealous of him. They wanted to ruin his career. So Raphael at that time was working on the School of Athens in one of the rooms. I believe it was the Pope's library. And Bramante was working on developing the new St. Peter's Church that now exists. Right now, the St. Peter's Basilica that exists is the newer version of St. Peter's Basilica, whereas before there was an older wooden version. And at that time, Pope Julius called in the best artists in the world, the best artists in Italy. At that time, they were the best artists in the world to work for him. That included Bramante, Raphael, and Michelangelo. And Bramante and Raphael wanted to embarrass Michelangelo. They wanted to ruin his career so they wouldn't have any rivals that they had to compete against. So Bramante and Raphael persuaded Pope Julius that instead of sculpting his tomb, which they said was a bad omen to sculpt somebody's tomb during their life, instead for him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And at that time, Michelangelo already spent a ton of money on quarrying the large marble blocks in Carrara, and he spent like 6 or 8 months in the mountains looking for the right marble to make his sculptures out of. And when Michelangelo was called in by the Pope changed his mind and he said, "You're going to paint the Sistine Chapel." And Michelangelo was furious because he did not expect this kind of turnaround. And he said to the Pope, "I'm not a painter. This isn't what I do. I'm a sculptor. I'm not a painter. I've only done like a few paintings in my life. I've not studied, I've not practiced fresco painting since I was in Ghirlandaio's studio when I was 13 or 14 years old. So, I'm not supposed to be doing this. You should give it to Raphael instead. He should do it." And the Pope said, "No, Michelangelo, you're going to do the Sistine Chapel, whether you like it or not. This is what's going to happen. You're going to stop work on my tomb and you're going to work on painting the Sistine Chapel." And after a lot of bad noise, after a lot of like frustration that Michelangelo was expressing to the Pope, finally he had to give in because he had no choice. He felt violated that his dreams of doing a large giant tomb that he wanted to do his whole life would ruin, and then he had to do this painting. So then he realized that there's no going back, and he knew that Bramante and Raphael were trying to undermine him, and he was determined to prove them wrong and make them look bad. So he knew that he had to approach it in the same intensity and the same passion that he would approach every single one of his works. The Pope originally wanted him to paint 12 apostles on the ceiling, but Michelangelo said, "You know what? If I'm going to do this, it's not going to be 12 apostles. That's too elementary. I'm going to do it my way." And he showed Pope Julius his plan, and it was a very elaborate plan. And the Pope Julius said, "Okay, Michelangelo, you do whatever you want. Just do it. Go ahead, do whatever you think you should do, and that's what you're going to be doing." And Michelangelo said, "Okay, I'm going to do it." The first thing that Michelangelo had to do before painting the Sistine Chapel was to make a whole plan, design a plan on paper of what each part of the ceiling would be. This was a convex ceiling. It was around the size of a football field. Just to put it in perspective, it was a giant ceiling of a chapel that was located in Vatican. And the reason it's called the Sistine Chapel is because it was built by, I believe, Pope Julius's uncle, Pope Sixtus. I don't remember his name exactly, but it was built by his uncle. And the Pope wanted to, glorify his uncle's legacy by having artists work there. And he chose Michelangelo, who he considered to be a great genius. And at that time, Michelangelo was really considered to be the best artist. At that time, mostly being a sculptor. So after he did the design for the entire ceiling of where every panel would be, he then would do sketches, like detailed sketches of every single figure on the ceiling. And he would probably hire models in his studio. He wasn't allowed, at that time there was the Roman Inquisition, so it was kind of like, it wasn't customary to work with nude female models because, they were crazy back then, and, they were very strict about that. So most likely Michelangelo used his young male assistants, in order to depict females on the ceiling of the chapel. And this is one of the criticisms a lot of people have, is that his females look very manly, but this is why that's the case. And he would do detailed studies of each figure, the nudes, all the muscles, as detailed as he could, for each figure in the composition. Then he would draw out the compositions. These were multi-figurative compositions. So he would draw them out and compose them separately with each figure that he studied. And there's over 400 figures on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that are over life-sized. Then what he did was, I believe he did a larger study, which was like maybe 3 times larger than the smaller study. And this was all the details drawing that was monochromatic. And Then he would do a grid method and translate that study into the real size cartoon. And the reason why it's called cartoon is because it's just a big, like uh, like um, like a board drawing that you would use to transfer the image onto the ceiling. And the way the grid method works is that you would do a square grid on top of the study, and you would do a square grid on top of whatever size the piece is supposed to be, and you would just copy by the grid, so it's exactly the same as it is on the study. So he did that, and in order to transfer on the fresco image on the ceiling, uh, you needed to make an outline. So he possibly had his assistants do this. He had his assistants do very kind of crude work because he didn't trust them with anything beyond that. He only trusted himself when it came to anything artistic. So he had his assistants take a needle and prick little holes going in the outline of the entire cartoon. And these were elaborate, very elaborate compositions, very sophisticated. And the way fresco works is that you put you put parts of wet plaster onto the ceiling, and you have to work against the clock to make things finished within probably, you have maybe, I don't know, 15 hours to paint a part on the fresco, and it has to be absolutely finished. And you have to do it part by part. So what he did was he would cut up different parts of the cartoon. Like, let's say he would do a hand. He would cut off a hand and he would just work on the hand. He would finish painting the hand. And then he would afterwards cut off the forearm, and then he would connect it to the hand, and then he would paint the forearm afterwards. So he did it piece by piece, kind of like a puzzle. And he did that on a football field sized surface that was convex. So he had to think about it in terms of it curving and how the figures would look correct 60 feet down. I believe it's 60 feet up. So they would be in correct proportion with the fact that the ceiling is convex and it's curving. So you have to think about it to that extent. So when he started work on the Sistine Chapel, he didn't know much about fresco painting. So he sent letters to the best fresco painters in Florence to get tips from them. He sent letters to his father, I believe to maybe his uncle as well, for them to buy up all the best pigments that he could use on the Sistine Chapel. They buy them all out in Florence as much as they could. And he sent them money to do that. And he started working on the first fresco, which was the Flood. And by the time he finished the fresco, and it took him maybe, this was like a part in the ceiling, one of the parts in the ceiling, it took him maybe 4 or 5 months to do this fresco, maybe even 7 months. I'm not sure exactly how long. And he noticed that there was mold growing on the ceiling, on the fresco, because in Rome it was very humid at that time, and there was a lot of you're working with wet surface, so there's mold coming to coming out of the fresco. So he realized that he needs to dry faster. So he had to break the fresco down, break the work that he did, which was very elaborate and very sophisticated and he did his best job on that flood painting, and he had to break it off and destroy it in order to repaint it again. But this time he went to Mount Vesuvius to get the volcanic sand from the mountain in order to mix it with his plaster so it would dry faster. So now he didn't have as much time anymore to paint that he did before. He had to do it even faster. And he would work day and night. He would actually design the scaffolding before doing it, he was the one who designed and engineered it, and he had him and his team build it. So that's another challenge that he had. And he worked literally day and night. At night, he would work in candlelight. He would have candle, like a visor around his head, and candles, shining. And it's a misconception that he was actually laying down painting it. He was actually standing up the whole time with his, like twisting and turning, and it caused a lot of pain in his back, to a point where he developed a hump by the time he finished the Sistine Chapel. And it was excruciating, the pain that he was feeling when doing it, on top of how difficult this project was technically. And news got out that he was doing this crazy work that nobody's ever done, and Raphael crept in to see it at night when Michelangelo wasn't there, because the Pope allowed him. The Pope gave him the keys. Or no, it wasn't the Pope. I'm sorry, it was Bramante. The Pope would not. I don't think the Pope would allow that. But Bramante had the keys to the Sistine Chapel, and he let Raphael see it by the time it was halfway done. And Raphael tried to persuade the Pope that he should finish it because he wanted the glory. Like, this was just very kind of very low and very petty of Raphael to do this. But he persuaded the Pope. He tried to persuade the Pope, and the Pope was not stupid. He said, "No, you're not touching it. Michelangelo's going to finish it. He started, and he's going to finish it." When Michelangelo found this out, he was furious, and he was really angry, not only that Raphael and Bramante were trying to undermine him, but also Raphael was trying to steal his idea, steal his painting, steal his glory. And the way the chapel is designed, I kind of see it in my head. I can see the panels. I think it's 9 main panels of the book of Genesis in the chronological order, along with prophets and sibyls and ancestors of Christ. And it's a very sophisticated design. The way it's designed, it's read in a very, it's meant to be read in a very specific manner, and you're supposed to see these figures that are just giant from 60 feet down. They're supposed to be as graphic and perfect from 60 feet down. And he actually was very, by the time he finished the Sistine Chapel, it was unveiled, it was like the greatest accomplishment anybody has ever done in terms of art. And everybody was in awe, and Bramante and Raphael were just completely stunned as well, and they had to acknowledge that Michelangelo was a great genius and greater than they are, even though they didn't want to, but they had no choice because he outdid them through so much hard work. He actually did most of the work himself, aside from doing the manual labor, which he left to his assistants, like mixing the plaster, maybe sometimes transferring the outlines of the compositions. Maybe he left to the assistants to paint the lettering, things like that, very kind of technical work that didn't require a lot of artistic knowledge. But maybe 99% of the work he did himself. And he was hailed as the greatest artist in the world at that time, not just the greatest sculptor, but the greatest artist, the master of the world, after he completed the Sistine Chapel. And he was, I believe he was 37 years old by that time. And, that kind of concludes the story of the Sistine Chapel. And I just want to say that, I think that Michelangelo, there's really nobody in history, in my opinion, who worked harder than Michelangelo. There might have been things that I may have not mentioned when it came to this painting the chapel. This is just the things that I know about him doing it. And I think there's nobody in history of the world who worked as hard as Michelangelo. I don't even think Nikola Tesla um, or any other great genius worked as hard as Michelangelo. Michelangelo really worked maybe sometimes over 20 hours a day to a point of exhaustion. And this is who I model myself from. I try to put in as much work as I can, even though I'm not as good as Michelangelo. I'm nowhere near as good as Michelangelo. Never will be probably as good as Michelangelo. I just don't believe that that's a possibility for me. But I do my best to do the best possible job that I can. And another thing I want to mention is that Michelangelo was actually not satisfied with his work afterwards because he thought that there's things wrong with it, that it's not perfect. Like one of his criticisms was that the flood that he painted, which was the first fresco painting in the fresco image in the chapel, that the figures were too small from 60 feet down. So afterwards he changed the size and the format of each of the figures. But enough of that, and I just want to say the last thing is that there are similarities and differences between me and Michelangelo, aside from him being a much greater artist than I'll ever be. We do have the same birthday. We're both born on March 6th. I'm born 512 years apart from Michelangelo. And in terms of differences in my work, apart from his work being far superior to what I do, is that what he did is what I do is the temporary truths of the world, while what Michelangelo did are the eternal truths of the world. And there's no other artist that I look at when I look at their work that I feel divinity, divine energy, divine aura, real warmth in my heart that Michelangelo gives me. And I recommend everybody who's watching this, who saw this, to go to Italy and see as many works by Michelangelo as you can, because seeing my documentaries, seeing images on Google or in books or whatever, it's not the same as seeing his works in real life. Because when you see his works in real life, they're really very intimate, and sometimes if you really understand what you're looking at, or I don't know, maybe if you see his work, you will also feel the divine aura, the warmth that I feel when I look at his work. So anyways, that's what I wanted to say about him painting the Sistine Chapel. And pardon me if I wasn't as concise in some of the parts that I expressed myself about the story of the Sistine Chapel. Pardon me if I rambled a little bit, but I did my best. Anyways, wishing everybody peace and love. Take care. Bye.